For those of you who do not know this arduous, accidental series, allow me to tell you a little bit about it. 8 years ago this month, I made a video where I ranked 11 senators that I personally thought were the best. However, that was based on pretty limited knowledge that I had at the time of the vast array of people who were in the Senate. And as I've done more research, I found at least a couple more that I thought were good enough to possibly have been contenders, so I made another video about them. And then I decided, why not turn this into a video series where I will make a lot more Senate rankings until I reach 100 senators. And once I do all that, I will then re-rank the senators based on what my views are at that time period. And at first the series was pretty easy because I found some pretty good diamonds in the rough. But now we're reaching the point where now the ones in this and the next couple of lists will probably just be slightly above standard. But the search continues, and you might get a chance to help. The remaining lists have not been finalized. I have some names in the notes, but again, nothing's been finalized. So feel free to leave comments down below of a senator that you think I should look over. I'd suggest watching the entire video first so that you don't name anybody who's in this video, and here's the list of all the senators that have made it into the list thus far so that you guys don't put any of their names in the comments. With that out of the way, let's reestablish some of the ground rules if this is again your first list. First, due to the aforementioned way that this series has even become a thing, the lists are essentially just self-contained. As of now, there's nothing really to say that any of the people on this list might not necessarily be better than the people on the previous list or the people on the next list. Like, basically all you're getting is number 1 on this list is better than number 5 on this list. For all we know, at the time that this series concludes, the list might be jumbled around a lot more. Especially that first list. Because, oh boy, I really could change a lot of the people on that list. Next, we'll be, of course, focusing on these people's tenures in the Senate, rather than any other office they held. Some of that might seep into their biographical statements, but otherwise, I'm really focusing on what they did in the Senate that makes them uniquely better in the Senate. Next, I originally was going to say incumbents will be kept to a minimum, but at this point I think incumbents are disqualified. I've basically made the list with the one incumbent that I actually care about. The rest of the incumbents I don't really care about. And if there are any good incumbents that happen after this fact, I don't think they'll have enough time to get listed on the rankings in the last videos. And lastly, of course, this is a more opinionated video. In case you need that spelled out. Like, yes, of course, there's going to be some biases when I rank certain senators. That's just a natural thing that's going to happen. Alright, here we go. The 7th Senate ranking video. Number 11, William J. Stone, Senator from Missouri from 1903 to 1918. Similar to other senators in the area, Stone represented the Midwestern populace well. The beginning thing of note was his opposition to World War I, being one of the 6 people who opposed it. However, unlike one of his allies on the issue, Stone also seemed to be not a virulent bigot. The most famous story on that front was when the American Protective Association, an anti-Catholic association that decided to work within the two-party system, tried to pressure Stone into not hiring Catholics in his staff. Stone would respond with, "Your association is undemocratic and un-American, and I am opposed to it. I haven't a drop of know-nothing blood in my veins." And yeah, that's basically all I got for Stone. He was not a bigot, and he opposed World War I. Number 10, Alan Cranston, Senator from California from 1969 to 1993. Now, I'm not just saying this so I can repeat the story of when Alan Cranston decided to use copyright infringement to steal money from Hitler. Check out this video I made on the subject. But if he didn't, he probably would have made it into one of the later lists. Cranston wasn't necessarily bad otherwise, but he's definitely a lot more of a normie Democrat compared to most of the others that I put on these lists. It didn't stop his opponent from labeling him a communist anyways. Cranston's main focus in the Senate was on the issue of foreign policy, publicly confronting the Pentagon over their claims that not renewing the draft would cause the US military to collapse, even threatening to filibuster a bill that would continue the draft. He would also introduce a bill that would reduce American forces overseas by 20%, tried to get the Reagan administration to negotiate a peaceful resolution to form a united Ireland, but one of his biggest concerns on this front was the concerns regarding nuclear war, being one of the loudest supporters for a nuclear freeze. However, he does get deducted points due to a situation regarding the Keating 5 scandal, where a savings and loan banker, Charles Keating, had contributed money to 5 senators in exchange for their help during the broader savings and loans crisis. But none of the 5 were indicted for any explicit wrongdoing, so that's a little bit more of a here and there thing. Although, speaking of, number 9, Don Regal, senator from Michigan from
1976
to 1995, one of the other Keating 5, who was also a 2-time Bernie bro, who also just died this year. So I suppose I should probably include him in one of these lists finally. Regal most prominently served as chair of the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. As such, his primary focus came in trying to reform the banking system to be more consumer-oriented. In response to the savings and loans crises that I brought up earlier, he would help enact the Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act of 1989, which enacted more regulations to make sure that the consumers wouldn't be screwed over by banks doing this in the future. He also led efforts to pass the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation Improvement Act of 1991, which sought to protect depositors specifically by expanding disclosure requirements in the banking industry. He would also use his position to launch an investigation into the illnesses experienced by Gulf War veterans, which would lead to the conclusion that many of the biological reasons that led to it were primarily due to the US's doing, not only because we were the ones bombing the factories that leaked the chemicals on our troops, but also that the pathogenic, toxigenic, and other biological research materials were exported to Iraq pursuant to application and licensing by the United States Department of Commerce. I mean, I guess if any senator had to be a Bernie bro, he probably makes somewhat sense. Number 8, Asle Grona, senator from North Dakota from 1911 to 1921. And much like other senators from this state and era, his primary focus seemed to be on foreign intervention, being the last non-white supremacist senator to vote against World War I. In fact, being the first nay vote, telling his colleagues that he did it because, "I believe it would have been possible to maintain an honorable peace with all the nations of the earth." And much like a future senator from his state, he would also call out weapons manufacturers for pushing the US into supporting this war. He opposed the deals that would give us the League of Nations, and was in favor of putting the eventual end of the war in the arms of the American people, by putting it to a referendum, a premise that was very common before and after him, worrying that being part of this alliance would simply drag the US into more foreign conflicts. While Grona wanted to focus on the more rural populist domestic affairs, this basically became his sole issue. And if anything had to be his sole issue, this is a good one. Number 7, Mark Hatfield, a very odd senator of Oregon from 1967 to 1997. He was clearly not your standard Republican. The closest label that seemed to fit him was the then budding label of libertarian. But even the libertarians at the time disagreed. Hatfield opposed the death penalty, supported civil rights legislation, and supported Martin Luther King Jr. Day. But obviously, labeling him a libertarian gives you the biggest indication of what made him different from many other Republicans, obviously being his stance on foreign intervention, co-sponsoring a bill with George McGovern to completely withdraw troops from Vietnam, teaming up with Ted Kennedy to push for a nuclear freeze, and being one of 2 Republicans to vote against the American involvement in the Gulf War. And one interesting bill that he repeatedly introduced was the Neighborhood Government Act, a bill that wanted to allow people the chance to divert their tax dollars from going to Washington, D.C., and instead invest that money directly in their community, which was introduced in an era when a lot of people were actively dodging taxes to avoid paying for the Vietnam War. While he did do it for more generic libertarian reasons, it just again shows his somewhat interesting perspective on a lot of these issues. Not necessarily the best of the people who opposed the Vietnam War, but not necessarily the worst either. Number 6. William E. Mason, the senator from Illinois from 1897 to 1903. Mason was known as part of the non-interventionist sentiment in the U.S. Congress, as during his second House tenure, he voted to oppose U.S. intervention in World War I. But that was after his Senate tenure. What happened during his Senate tenure that earned him a spot here is his position during the Filipino-American War, opposing this very clear example of American imperialism, being quoted as saying, "You cannot govern the Philippine Islands without taxing them. You have not yet their consent to tax them. You propose again to tax them without representation. Look out for tea parties." He doesn't really have much else going for him per se, but hey, being an opponent to American imperialism? Plus to me. Number 5. Dick Clark, senator from Iowa from 1973 to 1979. As a rural populist senator, Clark was generally well-liked, even as his record was noticeably liberal. While it was expected that his focus would remain on domestic agricultural issues like his state wanted him to, soon Clark would find himself on the Committee on Foreign Relations, and be given the leading post on the Subcommittee on Africa, which led to Clark to begin to do some homework on the continent to actively help change US policy in the area, specifically in the nations of South Africa, the US actively allying with the apartheid regime, and Angola, the US aiding right-wing paramilitaries to try and overthrow their government. Clark introduced an amendment to the U.S. Arms Export Control Act of 1976 to specifically bar the U.S. from aiding those two governments. While the USA was able to find loopholes to continue their games, Clark was able to scare South Africa so much that they quickly started bankrolling his opponent to make him a one-term senator. Number 4. Adlai Stevenson III, senator from Illinois from 1970 to 1981. The third wave of a prominent political family, and the only one of them to make it to the Senate. Stevenson seemed like a generic progressive Democrat in the vein of his family. He introduced a bill that would help foster international research into technology, oppose the Vietnam War, critique Nixon on Watergate, blah blah blah. Pretty generic stuff that nobody would really pay much attention to, given the other people that I've given on all the other lists. But the thing that very quickly got him into hot water was when he was tasked with creating bills in 1971 and 1979 that would provide coherent definitions of what classified as terrorism, seemingly not controversial, until it was discovered that Stevenson's definition of terrorism would have included the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and the bills would have actively made it so that the US would have to cut funding to Israel until they stopped. Stevenson would even meet with Yasser Arafat in 1976 in order to discuss a long-term peace deal, which would enrage AIPAC to the point where they would sabotage Stevenson's attempt to become governor of Illinois, with Adlai becoming a lot more vocal about his feelings with AIPAC after the fact, being quoted as saying, "It is the Israeli lobby, led by AIPAC, which I deplore. It does not speak for all Jewry, including Israeli Jewry, yet it exercises an inordinate degree of influence with weak public officials. I deplore their subservience to the vagaries of a foreign government." Just thought we could all use a little bit of a flashback to a time when politicians used to hate AIPAC. It was way more common than you think. Number 3. Rufus King, senator from New York from 1789 to 1796 and 1813 to 1825. Wait, A Federalist actually made the list? Man, he must have been really good to warrant being here. And boy, he sure was, because Rufus King was, as far as I can tell, America's first anti-slavery senator, at least in an actual political sense. You see, while there were apparently a ton of people in the political class that at the time might have privately abhorred slavery, clearly they did not abhor it enough to do anything about it. King was apparently the first one to actually advocate for policies to, at the very least, begin phasing out of slavery. He successfully added provisions to the 1787 Northwest Ordinance to stop the admittance of those new territories as slave states, tried to add provisions to the Missouri Statehood Bill to prevent it from becoming a slave state, and even attempted to end the domestic slave trade in 1817. He even fought hard against New York from adding a law to ban voting from freed men. While King was an advocate for the gradual form of emancipation rather than immediate emancipation, I think that's because very early on there were paths that actually could have been taken to be a gradual emancipation. And he at least deserves credit for actually bringing the issue to people's attention and, again, trying to solve it before things got to a position where it went in a specific path. Number 2. John Sherman Cooper. The senator from Kentucky on 3 separate occasions. While his partisan label was Republican, his early voting record seemed to indicate otherwise, leading to a confrontation with Robert Taft, where he asked, "When are you going to start voting with us?" Cooper opposed the Republican efforts to cut taxes and ban collective bargaining, alongside pushing against voter suppression of minorities. His second stint in the Senate was mostly focused on the issue of McCarthyism, where he made a point to oppose its most egregious free speech violations. But his last stint in the Senate was the most impactful, as it was in the heart of 2 large activist movements in the US. Cooper voting for every single civil rights bill, signed onto the Medicare bill, and even supported a single-payer bill written by Ted Kennedy. But of course, the thing that would end up taking most of his attention would be the Vietnam War, actively trying to get it ended almost as soon as it began. Most of the time, usually just by getting them to follow the rules that were set in previous negotiations in Geneva. And when it became apparent that there were ambitions in the region beyond Vietnam, he would also oppose the US getting more actively involved, most prominently by teaming up with Frank Church to put forth a few amendments that would halt all US military support in Cambodia, alongside also just being an opponent to war more broadly, such as being an opponent to the creation of an anti-ballistic missile program, as he feared that it would lead to the escalation of the nuclear arms race. Funnily enough, I think he actually summed up his entire career with his response to Taft on that ill-fated day: "I intend to vote as I think best." And number 1 for now, Joseph France, senator from Maryland from 1917 to 1923. Now, it's a slight surprise that he made it this far on the list, as he actually voted for World War I. And we'll come back to that part a little later, but first, let's focus on the rest of his career in the Senate. He was an early supporter of helping African Americans, fighting against voter disenfranchisement, speaking out in favor of an anti-lynching bill, and introduced a bill that would allow black railroad passengers in first class to actually get first-class accommodations. While fighting for African American civil rights is obviously a plus, and would obviously have gotten him a spot on the list, the thing that puts him all the way up to number 1 is that while he wasn't as forthcoming in regards to World War I itself, he did end up becoming a loud opponent against one of the largest ways World War I was used to silence dissent via trying to stop the Sedition Act, comparing its passage to the United States entering the Dark Ages. Another area where he actually had a little bit of foresight was when he actively encouraged the United States to form cordial relationships with the Soviet Union, even to the point where he actually earned the slight favor of Lenin. And honestly, so much could have been avoided if we didn't have that Soviet fixation that we had. So yeah, that's the wrap-up of this Senate list. Again, you can see that we are creeping closer and closer to the end game. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and click the bell to notify when a future video comes out. And if you want more content from me, consider supporting me on Patreon.